Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matt Parisi. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Tealium, and I will be your moderator today for how to supercharge your customer data to power predictive insights. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar will last approximately 30 minutes and will be recorded. The recording will be made available to you afterwards. We have some related resources available for you in the attachments and links section of the platform, so feel free to download those at any point. If there's something that you find helpful or important during this webinar, we encourage you to share socially, and you can mention at Tealium. We want to hear your questions, so please use the Q&A feature to submit them. For any questions that we aren't able to answer live, we'll follow up with you afterwards. So with that, let's move on to today's presenters. Today we have Tealium experts with you from all walks of the business. We have Dave Lucas, our Senior Director of Product, Richard Morrow, our Director of Customer Success, and like I mentioned earlier, my name is Matt Parisi, Tealium's Senior Product Marketing Manager. Let's get started. So, today we are going to go over the 5 dimensions of data readiness. So we'll talk about what you need to be thinking about with your data foundation to be ready for advanced analysis, such as machine learning. We'll talk about the process to becoming ready. We'll give you just a tiny little sneak peek at a product that Tealium is actually releasing on June 30th called Tealium Predict ML, our new machine learning powered feature. And then we'll summarize all the great things we talked about before heading into some Q&A. So definitely keep those questions ready for us. So like I mentioned, there are 5 elements to data wellness. These 5 dimensions are things that we ultimately help our customers achieve with their foundations to get them ready for advanced uses of their data, like machine learning. The first element that we'll go over is defining your ML strategy and how important that is ultimately to all of the rest of the pillars or elements of data wellness. Then we'll talk about data completeness. We'll go over data integrity and how important data quality is to your data wellness. We'll hop into some features of governance and consent before finishing off with accessibility and how important the accessibility of your data is for something like machine learning. So let's hop into the first aspect of data wellness, and that is defining your strategy. So with that, I'm going to bring in Richard and Dave. Hi, guys. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, great to be here.
So first off, Richard, what are some major elements you would recommend that companies define prior to even thinking about the tools or ultimately how their data is going to need to be organized to be used for ML?
Yeah, interesting. So my background is a strategist, actually. So I always think of this from a strategic purview of understanding who am I going after and why. And I think once you have those 2 elements, meaning who are my segments or audiences that I wish to utilize ML with, and once I know I have something, where do I need that prediction to go so that I can use it? And when I have that concept or that idea, then I start thinking about what data do I need to be successful here. So you need to start documenting and visualizing all the different things you're going to need end to end in order to be successful. And then once you have that idea or that concept that you wish to power through ML, then you need to think about, well, what are the KPIs, right? Because what it is you're going to be leveraging a new data source or a data type that says this is the person to go after or not go after. And then you're going to get predictions, but ultimately you're going to wonder, is this thing working, right? It's like the electronic, you're going to shake it and be like, how do I know this thing's working? And that's the KPIs that tell you, is it getting better than your baseline? Is it getting worse than your baseline? And once you have all those elements, then you have a strategy where you can start pulling in the people and moving forward with a project plan to be successful.
Interesting. So Dave, I guess as it relates kind of to the fact that people are going to have a lot of different strategies, obviously, with what they want to do with ML, and you've had to build a product now for people who are ultimately trying to get their data ready for ML, how would these considerations affect kind of the capabilities you need to ultimately deliver on that vision? So even if you know exactly what you're going to do, how does that relate to kind of what you're doing with your data? Because you're not always going to know exactly what you're going to do. So like sometimes you're going to have to come in the middle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always an iterative process, which is kind of an important thing to know. Like you never want to, just like Richard was mentioning, everything around your business strategy, you already know and accept that this evolves over time. And so it's sort of the same thing on a smaller scale when it comes to doing a machine learning project. You're probably not going to knock it out of the park the first time. And so by having that focus where you start on the strategy, you're not just starting with a piece of technology itself or a certain code base itself. You can set yourself up with the right mindset to kind of move through these iterations faster and with a North Star, if you will. And in my experience, my background is more on the data science end and running data science teams, and that was always a key thing. It's easy to say we're just going to do a machine learning project as kind of an exploratory model or an R&D type thing. But even when you do that, if you don't have clear strategic use for that, that it affects a customer facing team or a marketing team, then you might kind of just be spinning your wheels in the way you implement that.
Interesting. Yeah. So I guess what we're highlighting here is that before you kind of even think about organizing your data, you need to know why you're organizing the data. So I think that's a really good point, because in general, that's the only way you're going to be successful is by thinking about what is that end goal and how am I going to measure it before you even, kind of document what your strategy is going to be. All right. Well, let's move on to the next dimension that we have here. That's not the dimension one that we have here, which is the idea of data completeness. So, Richard, I guess can you tell us what is data completeness? What are the elements of data completeness that you actually need to think about for a machine learning project?
Yeah, this could get pretty deep, right? Like, does this complete me? So if you think about your use case, it's deep, right? It's the depth of data, or how much data do you actually have? Because the breadth of data that you're collecting actually allows an algorithm to be that much better at predicting something. So the first thing you need to consider is like, how much referenceable data am I collecting when I'm trying to predict something? And that sounds like a very complicated thing to even try to figure out, well, what the hell is this guy talking about? But really what I'm saying is that if you're trying to understand whether or not someone's going to abandon their cart, how much data during that journey or that cart abandonment process are you collecting in a breadth type wise, meaning width, that allows you to understand different things, or allows an algorithm to start chunking through to say, this is beneficial to predicting it, or this is not beneficial to predicting it. And that's the contextual stuff you need to think about, is how much extra data around that event do I have available so that I can feed more to this algorithm to be smarter. And then how much of that data is actually happening, right? A lot of times what I've found in talking to customers is that they're looking for a very edge case event that they're trying to predict. And it just doesn't happen that often for there really to be enough data to say, we can predict this or we can't, right? If it only happens 5 times a day, you're better off just flipping a coin, because that's really as good as you're going to get from any algorithm. There's just not enough data to go around at that point. So when I think about that, that's exactly what I'm dialing into.
Cool. So depth and breadth. So it's not only about kind of having a lot of data, but kind of having a variety of it so that the machines can kind of sift through it all to understand it. But of course, that data has to be organized in a particular way for the machine to understand it. So Dave, based on how you typically roll out an ML project, why is data completeness an important consideration?
Yeah, I think it comes down to the fact, and anyone out there who's working on any of these projects themselves will agree, I'm sure, is the fact that the ends of a data science project right now take the most time. So up front, you've got all this work you have to do to collect data, usually from multiple sources, combine it, clean it, wrangle it, all that stuff, that obviously ties into this end goal of having as much data completeness as possible. And then you do some machine learning on it, and then it typically, the result lives in an isolated place. So you've sort of perpetuated the problem where you haven't, reintegrated those results into your overall data set. So in some sense, you haven't harnessed a new level of completion, if you will. So the idea is to see the industry move forward in terms of tools that kind of handle some of this heavy lifting on both ends for you and ensure that the results of your ML are more immediately reintegrated back into society, if you will.
Cool. All right, so very important dimension, data completeness. I think we covered that one pretty well. So we're going to move on to the next element of data wellness here, data integrity. So this is where we're talking kind of about data quality, making sure that the data that goes in is high quality so that the insights you get out ultimately are also high quality. Richard, how would you define data integrity? What are the elements that you would encourage people to think about as they're figuring out like whether or not their data has enough integrity?
Yeah, I would say how much time do you spend fixing data on Excel sheets is really the good litmus test of data integrity. Yeah, I've managed a data team here at Tealium. Like even we spend a good amount of time taking data from different systems to get it to tell the same story or to get that one parameter to mean the same thing on another spreadsheet. So now you find yourself just changing column headers to get one consistent data set, and then you got to figure out how to blend it. So the first thing I think about a data integrity and going back to the strategy, right, is who am I going after? What's all the data that I need? Does it have this concept of a data layer? And how I explain a data layer is that you're constantly importing data into consistent data terms or data variables so that you can leverage that downstream a lot easier. So at this point, you're saving the data scientist time and doing all the pre-work, all the cleaning, the stuff that data scientists get paid to do that they shouldn't be doing, and actually solving that for what we call this concept of a data layer or data standardization, so to speak. And then we've got to worry about, well, how consistent is that when we collect it over time, which is also a big problem with a lot of companies, is that you'll notice that even though everyone agreed to call it the same thing, sometimes the values just aren't there, or a number suddenly becomes a string value. So rather than a 4, I'm getting Alaska. Well, that doesn't help me when it comes to an ML. It's actually just adding a lot of confusion and making that data less valuable as you start going through these practices. And then while you're getting that consistency of data over time, how do you then ensure that it's actually there? So data validation within systems is also key. So once you figure out how to get it all merged into like data terms, you got to worry about how is that consistently going to come in and how do I monitor it, right? Because if something does go wrong, and something always does go wrong, it's inevitable. How do you recognize it so that it doesn't pollute maybe your algorithm sooner than later, or has a lot of bad data in it? So there's a lot of considerations there, but this is what I think about when I think of data integrity.
Right. Yeah, it's not only about kind of the tools and the things you're able to do at the end of the day with technology and capabilities, but the practices that you have in place that those tools ultimately enable, right? So I think we're going to get into governance next. We'll probably get a little bit deeper into what you're talking about there. Dave, why is data integrity, beyond the obvious garbage in, kind of garbage out, like why is data integrity such an important thing for machine learning projects?
Yeah, so Richard gave a great answer. He covered a lot of the technical end of it, and everything he said is true for a small data project, but it's just amplified now for ML. So all those points are great. And then the other end of it I just add to this is that, when you think through all these challenges and all this cleanup work that has to be done, it's just so critical that we get to a point where these are more like automated processes, or even if they're manual, they only have to be done once instead of routinely. And so that's why, over time, I definitely expect to see data scientists in industry doing, cutting edge projects. Instead of having to do so much of that manual cleanup themselves, they're going to start using other data sources that already have it programmatically done or automatically done for them. one example might be if you want to do a machine learning project on customer data, you could use a customer data hub type tool as your source, because in theory it has that 360-degree view of your user already. And it can have a variety of things feeding it, whether it's APIs or a tag management solution, that sort of thing. And it's a little bit closer to set it and forget it. I don't want to use that term and oversell it, but those kinds of hub technologies are going to become more and more useful over time as the fuel for these projects.
Interesting, though, that automation is such a critical component of integrity, because ultimately, if you're not automating it, you're probably making manual mistakes, I would imagine.
Yep.
Cool. All right. So let's hop over to governance and consent. So let's start with Richard again. And Richard, from your standpoint, what is governance and consent? Why are we talking about consent with governance? What are these things that we need to, when we're thinking about using customer data for ML, what are the major kind of considerations within governance and consent?
Yeah, for sure. I think even those terms could mean the other thing, vice versa. When I think of governance, when you're automating it, like Dave said, it's kind of internal governance, or how is the company or the entity agreeing to name the data variables? How are they agreeing to unify that data or ingest the data? How are they agreeing to process it? All that falls under what I consider data governance. And then when you think about data governance, you're almost thinking of compliance as well, which then bleeds into the consent piece. So are what we're doing compliant with the governance piece, which is more of an internal aspect that you need to have all your stakeholders understand and agree upon on how are we processing this data, how are we storing it, so on and so forth. And then it goes back to the individual with likenesses of GDPR, CCPA. Me as a person and an individual, I could also dictate how a company is able to utilize that data, right? So not only do I have my internal corporate stakeholders, I'm a stakeholder with my own data with a lot of these companies, and I could say, I no longer give you the consent to use my data. So now we're hitting, like I said, it could be the head eating the tail, right? It becomes this circular thing, but in the end, governance needs to be agreed upon with the automation or the processing of the data, how you're storing the data, and how everyone's ensuring that that's how the company wants to utilize the data. And then ultimately the individual who could basically go and say, hey, company, I no longer wish for you to use my data in that way. And you need to be ready for that and have a system that says, okay, we'll take care of that for you.
Yeah. Which, if we're talking about a siloed system that Dave just referred to might be easier said than done, I would say.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, Dave. So from an ML standpoint, why are these things normally such a challenge?
Yeah, because the way you normally do it involves isolation. It all happens, the way a model is normally done, the way I used to make them, the way my team would make them is essentially it's one or two people, doing all this in isolation. They pull down the data set, they work with it extensively, and then that training data that trained your algorithm, that snapshot, if you will, is still just sitting there. So if later you've got someone who was in that training data set who opts out, how are you going to go back in and manually prune them out of this? And what if you have 100 projects or 100 data sets like this? It becomes just a nightmare, honestly. So, the goal here would be to eventually get to a point where our machine learning data sets live in such a way or in such a place that they are governed and they can be purged surgically, for visitor deletion requests in a way that's more compatible with the broader data source that they're being pulled from in the first place.
Which is a excellent segue into our next topic of accessibility. So when we're talking about accessibility and data accessibility for the purposes of running ML analysis and then using ML to personalize customer experiences, Richard, can you give us what we would think about as far as accessibility? Like when you're talking about having a data foundation that's accessible for ML, what does that mean?
Yeah, I would say time is against everything you're trying to do, right? When I think of accessibility, data silos creates the time it takes to get all that data together so that you can use it for ML. And the time that you're wasting taking that snapshot of data is still coming in, but you're not utilizing that on your latest algorithm, right? So you already have a gap in the data you collected and the data that you're trying to train against, where that could be a big important holiday that has completely different data that's arisen, because it's like Memorial Day and that's huge for you as a retailer. But if you're trying to make a prediction that doesn't include the previous Memorial Day, it may not be accurate for what you're trying to do. So time is constantly against you with what you're trying to do, and how long it's taking for that snapshot to have the algorithm turn something around. And then you have this other problem in the data silo context of, okay, data science did their job and they got these predictions ready. Now I need to hand it to all my stakeholders. They need to upload it. So now you've got data getting stale because they're trying to activate it. So that's you have a lot of constraints with accessibility. So what you need to do is, when you're automating all this, you're ensuring that the data pipe is refreshing data into the algorithms as fast as possible from when it's collected. And ultimately, when those predictions are made, they're getting outbound as fast as they can, so that it's not stale data that you're predicting upon, or it's not stale data that you're trying to activate. And those are the two things that are working against you when I think of accessibility.
Cool. So I think, so Dave, we have to go through this one a little bit quick, but
Sure.
I think that's part of the reason why what we built ultimately with Tealium Predict is actually like really cool, is that ultimately you're doing ML in a place that's already kind of rich with customer data. Yep. And is kind of already integrated with a person's MarTech stack, which I think is unique in the marketplace as far as like how people normally do ML. Normally it's in a separate silo, you mentioned earlier, that's not necessarily integrated. So, you know, what are some of the challenges that people run into if they don't do their ML kind of in the same place where their, you know, customer data is largely living?
Yeah, great question, and Richard nailed a lot of it, so I won't repeat that too much. But the idea that, yeah, there's all this separate infrastructure in these silos, and it's difficult to get the results into the hands of the stakeholders. That's all really true. And then this occurs for every team. The marketers don't have the results they need in time to act on it, or in a way that it's actionable. And even the data scientists themselves are usually going back and forth with, you know, operations or engineering, trying to do those iterations and make sure production is working well and scale the infrastructure and all this stuff. So there's many layers of this problem. And then there's just the everyone getting on the same page from a business logic standpoint and not having silos between teams, which is where a solution like what we built with Predict can be great, because in a customer data platform, I'm going to make an assumption, which I think is somewhat fair here, that some of your collective business logic has already been baked into that, especially by the marketing team, because they're usually a heavy stakeholder here. So we've already kind of solved that problem somewhat.
Cool. Perfect. So that is the extent of our talk today. We at the end here, we did want to mention that the process, that data wellness is not a one-time event. It is an ongoing process, and it's ultimately a journey to get to the place where your data is well, but it continues from there. So Richard, just as an expert in kind of helping Tealium's customers become well with their data, so that ultimately you can do all those cool things that everybody's talking about with personalization, you know, what are the steps that you generally lead people down to become well with their data?
Yeah, and audit's a big thing, right? You need to, like I mentioned before, you need to understand not only what you're trying to do, but what do you already have. What I would say is integrated in processing. That's a big one. And then the definition of what you're collecting, how you're collecting it, really allows the enablement or the remarketing to create those segments and really bring value. I think the data governance and practices are normally well established when you're bringing data into a CDP or into a system like ours, but it's definitely something that needs to be revisited. And then ultimately, I think in this process, by understanding how the data is coming in, how you're enriching it, and how that's integrated to your downstream vendors, it's only going to allow you to be a much better utilizer of the data. And normally what I'd like to say is that if you're doing something well within the CDP, like a system like ours, that Predict is only going to allow you to do bigger, better things. So capitalize on it, build upon what you already have a baseline for, and take that to the next level.
Cool. Like I did mention there, Tealium does offer this service, the data wellness package. So we're helping our customers get their data to a state where, in the screenshot on the right, basically that hopefully you see as many healthy attributes as possible, because ultimately the more healthy attributes you have that you can use for prediction, the more, the more strategic you can be as a marketer, using that data to not only acquire new customers, but hopefully maximize customer, retention to, drive the highest possible lifetime value for your customers based on these predictions. These predictions ultimately help you as a marketer know where to focus your time and budget on the people who, it's actually going to make a difference with because of their propensity to purchase or their propensity to become an email, subscriber, or whatever action you ultimately might be predicting to create a better experience for. We, like I mentioned earlier, we also are coming out with a new product called Tealium Predict ML. Tealium Predict ML adds the power of machine learning insights to our customer data platform. It gives marketers another data point to ultimately use to strategically tailor customer experience so that ultimately you're only spending your time and money in the place where it's going to make the biggest impact. We do have time for a couple of questions. So we've only got a minute for each one of these. So Dave and Richard, keep your answers somewhat short. But for Richard, is there one overarching learning from doing this with a lot of customers that you would highlight for people out there as far as like what they pick, how they pick what they're going to do ultimately?
Yeah, we have a good saying that says, don't try to build a spaceship when you start anything. And ML doesn't allow you to build a spaceship. So start with what you know, capitalize upon that with ML to allow to make that life a little bit easier, to enhance it a little bit, and go from there. But you don't need a spaceship to use algorithms with. Start off slow. When you become an expert, go ahead and take it to the next level.
Cool. And maybe Dave, you can actually build on his answer there. I'm curious, given that we just built this really cool new product that we're pretty proud of, what are some of the main use cases that you've seen? What are some companies doing? What's the result? What's the benefit of actually getting your data to this wellness place? What are some of the cool things that you could ultimately be doing if you've got that asset?
Sure, yeah, and like Richard said, a lot of this comes back to improving what you're already doing. And frankly, in the year 2020, I think it's extremely important, even more than normal, to not necessarily try to build that spaceship, but to just focus on how can we give our customers the best experiences for what we're already doing for them. How can we do that in a better way right now, right? Because customer confidence is shaky right now all around the world. Everybody's going through a lot. And then we've also got the efficiency piece. Every marketing department, every leader feels pressure to be more performant and more efficient right now. And using machine learning as a tool to augment what you already do in your MarTech use cases is a great way to bump up your efficiency. So between all of that together, it's a great look for your brand right now. And I think that's the key thing. When I work with companies across different industries, the things they have in common are that they're all really focusing the same way. They're having the right conversations internally among teams, and they kind of have champions leading them about how we'll act on this, how it'll affect the business, what are we trying to make more efficient, I guess, is the end result. And so that tends to make the specific use cases feel almost obvious if you have that conversation beforehand.
Give us like one customer acquisition and one customer retention
Sure.
example.
So, a huge one we see, right, is around abandonment campaigns. The way everyone does abandonment campaigns now, something like cart recovery, is just super broad. Just target every single person who abandoned, and that's highly inefficient, and it spams a lot of people. So we're able to see some nice improvements there. And then for retention, it's also really great for things like loyalty programs or trying to entice new VIPs, or we've seen it work really well for more like nonprofit donors to kind of bump them up in the category of in the donor tiers. So, those themes, right, cross over industries where it's all about how can we make really certain that we're investing the right marketing resources, copy, campaigns with you to give you the right experience.
Cool. So basically, like if you've got a VIP audience already, well, why don't we predict the people who are likely to become a VIP and then target those people with extra special action because we know that it's a higher value target.
Exactly. You can even time box that, which is great in our tool because, in my mind, if I want to do cart recovery, I don't want to use a model that's what is your likelihood to purchase forever into the future, right? I need you to come back and recover this cart in 2 days or whatever that logic is. I think of it as 2 days personally. So, I need those differences there. So being able to have different flavors of a model around coming back to purchase is a great example of ways we've seen companies have success.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have for questions. If we did not get to your question, don't worry. We will follow up with you after the fact. So if you submitted them, definitely thank you for that. Sorry we did not get to your question today. But I do want to say thanks to Dave and Richard for coming on today and kind of talking about some of the things that we're seeing with our customers. Please be sure to check out the related resources if you haven't already. So once the webinar ends, underneath your screen there, you should be able to see the related resources. And if Predict sounds like something that is interesting to you, definitely feel free to reach out. We'd love to think about how it might make your marketing programs, your existing ones that you have going. Whether you're a Tealium customer or not, like we said, our ML product is part of our CDP. So there are far more values in addition to ML that Tealium can bring to you. So definitely give it a look. But thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks Dave and Richard, and we'll see everyone. Remember, we have another ML webinar on June 30th in partnership with Forrester. So that one should be exciting. Dave will be on that one as well, and we hope to see you there. All right, bye-bye everyone.
Thanks everyone.